everyone. I'd like to virtually welcome all of you to the Armenian Institute tonight. I'm Tatevik Ayvazyan, the Institute's director. We, like anyone else connected to Armenia and Armenians, have been living in alternative reality since the 27th of September. The war is formally over now, but devastation it has caused is too great to comprehend yet. The loss of life, homes, health, cultural monuments, and very often hope. Since the beginning of the war at the Institute, we tried to do our best to talk about different aspects of the conflict touching all of us. And this evening is one of those events, and we'll talk about how we can move to a more meaningful resolution of the situation. To discuss this with us, we have three speakers tonight, and they'll be led by my colleague, the Armenian Institute trustee Tatiana Der Avedissian. There will be an introduction by Tatiana, and we'll hear all the speakers separately. Then you'll have a chance to ask questions. The event is live on Facebook, so you can ask your questions in Facebook comments, which we'll be monitoring, or in the chat line. I'm sure our speakers will do their best to try to answer at least some of them. Everyone is on mute at the moment, but like I said, you can communicate with us via Facebook comments and chat line. I'd like to thank to my colleagues who organized this event, Susan Patty, Anushka Berberian, Stephen Masters, and Olivia Melkonian. Over to you, Tatiana.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is not an easy time for Armenians globally, and especially those in Nagorno-Karabakh. There is so much confusion and uncertainty, unsettled feelings and feelings of loss. For almost a month since the agreement was signed, Armenians have spent a lot of time discussing with friends and family the outcomes of this war and what went wrong, who to appropriate blame to, and what else could have been done. We have spent a lot of time wrestling with our own minds, asking the question, did I do enough? Our concerns have not been addressed, and instead we are now caught in this even bigger geopolitical quagmire than before, with many of us unable to see a clear path out. Once again, Armenians have been used as pawns in a bigger game. So where do we go from here? We have with us this evening Professor Eileen Babbitt, a political consultant, Eric Hacopian, and journalist Thomas de Waal. Thank you all for joining. Eileen Babbitt is a professor of practice of international conflict management at Tufts University. She is the former director of the Henry Lear Institute and co-director of the Program on Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Thomas de Waal is a senior associate on the caucus at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is the author of the caucus and an introduction, Black Garden, and co-author with Carlotta Gol of Chechnya. Eric Hacopian is a 30-year veteran of American politics, having worked on campaigns from the local to the presidential level. For the past 22 years, he has been the principal at EDH & Associates, a Southern California-based democratic consulting firm. Since 2017, Eric Hacopian has been living in Armenia while continuing his practice. I want to, I'll start off asking all of you actually for some of your thoughts on the ceasefire agreement, since it was signed just under a month ago. We're no clearer on those terms and what is actually happening. So what were your initial thoughts and when the ceasefire was declared, and how have those changed since then? I'll start with you, Eric, actually.
Well, I mean, it's the same level of uncertainty, to be honest. There's so much that is not clear about what this ceasefire means, how it's being implemented. But there's a few things about it that are very clear. The Russians have moved in a significant way, and they are essentially setting up the ceasefire regime. They're there in a much bigger way than anything that's written in the agreement. They have far more troops, far more equipment than was ever in the agreement. That's very clear, just from the videos of what's going in and out. So I think what we might be looking at is the beginning of we could very well have two Armenias next to each other, an Armenian Armenia and a Russian Armenia, or a Russian province with Armenian-speaking people. It's the only thing that's clear about this, given how much uncertainty there is about the specifics of the agreement, is the aggressive way that the Russians have moved in, their systematic efforts to a great extent to sideline Erdogan specifically, and to provide, the basics of security, which is something that is appreciated here at least, and separating the two sides, and being forceful about how they're doing things. And the other interesting thing is Putin's actions over the last couple of weeks, which have been, he's repeatedly done things to prop up the current government in Armenia, which is a surprise to many because the perception has always been that they didn't like the current post-revolutionary government. But I think in this particular period, since they really want this agreement implemented, I think they're supportive of the current government. And it's the thing that has stood out for me is Putin's language, which has been very interesting. And twice in this last month, he has discussed the issue and the importance of having some kind of what he refers to as status for Nagorno-Karabakh. And he has also spoken in very frank terms about Armenian grievances, both in going back to 1988 and Sumgait and how Armenians were targeted, how this was an ethnic conflict. And twice, unprompted, he has brought up the whole issue of the Armenian genocide and the fear that Armenians have, especially of the Turkish involvement here. General confusion about how this agreement is going to be implemented. That's married to very forceful Russian action about moving in and implementing this in very strong ways. That has pretty much, there's no more fighting, there's hardly any shooting, there's fortunately no more dying. Those are the two things that stand out. Other than that, it's just a whole bunch of confusion as far as what this agreement means. There's obviously domestic political issues here, which frankly, what I learned that people outside the country think there are that really are. Most, life is actually quite normal here, as unhappy as people are. But it's that in and of itself is going to have to resolve itself over the next couple of months, and I suspect that it will. But those are my general observations. It's general confusion and Russian forcefulness. Those are the two things that I would say stand out in the last 3 weeks.
Thank you. What about you, Tom?
Yes, well, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I would agree. I see what's basically a truce, a deal, but it's definitely not peace. And obviously, we're a long way from any kind of sustainable peace. And all peace. The peace process in the past has envisaged some kind of Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization, which clearly is a long way off. There was actually a statement, remember the Minsk group co-chairs, well, they still exist. There was a statement by them today by France, the US, and Russia from the OSCE summit, which sort of welcomed the deal, referred a little to basic principles and substantial talks, and the right of return and so on. But again, the language was much more muted than in past OSCE statements. A lot of uncertainty going forward. I would actually disagree a little with Eric. Putin has fairly clearly stated that he sees Karabakh as being within Azerbaijan. That I think the status issue is now pretty much off the table. I think that the question really is whether the Karabakh Armenians in the future are promised some kind of territorial autonomy, which Azerbaijan has now ruled out pretty explicitly, or some kind of cultural autonomy, which is obviously doesn't mean very much within the context of present day Azerbaijan. But this is a 5-year. I think it's very important to underline this is a 5-year agreement, and 6 months before that 5 years expires, one of the sides, presumably Azerbaijan, would have the right, theoretically, to veto the extension of the peacekeeping mandate. Now, obviously, the Russians will want to stay, but I think we're going to see a lot of bargaining between Moscow and Baku, with, I'm afraid, the Karabakh Armenians themselves having very little agency in this about what happens at the end of 5 years. I see Moscow's interest, and here I would agree with Eric, in people returning to Karabakh, in there being people to protect, in there being a raison d'etre for this peacekeeping mission, which justifies them having boots on the ground back in the South Caucasus. Equally, I would see an Azerbaijani agenda to want to see a kind of gradual emptying of Karabakh, that it doesn't become sustainable, that people leave. And at the end of 5 years, they can say, well, there's no one there to protect, and the Russians should pack up and go home. So I'm afraid not a very optimistic message for an Armenian audience, but I would see a lot of bargaining between Moscow and Baku in the coming 5 years over the status of Karabakh. What can Armenians do about it? I guess that's what we'll be talking about very much this evening. I won't go into that quite yet.
Thank you, Tom. Eileen, what about yourself? What were your thoughts?
As distinct from my colleagues here, this region is not a specialty of mine, although obviously I've been following closely what's been going on. As was said, this is not a peace agreement, it's a ceasefire. And there's lots of details not addressed. And I would think that there would be, because this is a holding pattern, there would be some discussion about a negotiation process, either short-term, medium-term, in this period. I would hope Armenia would be at the table, that it would not simply be between Azerbaijan and Russia, which also brings up the question of what is Russia's role? Are they the mediator? And if so, should they be balanced by the continuation of input from the United States and France and other members of the OSCE? One of the things I've noted is that the OSCE Minsk process over the last 10 years has been pretty much dead in the water, not much happening. Hard to know whether that actually can be revived in its current form. With the US going through a political transition at the moment, not sure when or how the US could step up or will. It would be great if the mediation process were broader than Russia, because of the interest that both of my colleagues have mentioned that they have in both the military and political aspects of this. I think there are a lot of issues, even in the short term, to be figured out because, again, the ceasefire deal is so sparsely worded. Yes, there's return promised, but how is that going to happen? What kind of security is going to be provided? What's the governance situation in this region over the next period? Lots of things still to be worked out. And from my point of view, and especially thinking from the perspective of Armenia, which I know most of our audience is interested primarily in, I would hope that there would be some very important preparation for Armenia to do at this point in preparing to engage in such negotiations. And I can go into detail about what I think they will need to do, but I think this should not be something that's done ad hoc. It has to be very well thought through. Lessons learned from what did and did not work over the last 20 years, and some different strategies adopted based on the realities of what's happening on the ground right now. And I would really encourage our Armenian colleagues in Yerevan and in the wider Armenian community to think about what that strategy might be, because a lot is going to rest on what happens over the next 5 years.
Thank you all. I think you've all very much brought up a lot of the key challenges that and the sort of thoughts that are going through a lot of people's minds at the moment. And you know, I mean, this war brought about the near destruction and ethnic cleansing of Armenians from the region, and it has destabilized Armenia. And Eileen, as you say, it's important that Armenia is part of that negotiation process. War crimes have been reported and committed, and countless human rights violations. I mean, how do these two communities, or should we say three communities, how do they move forward? What are the chances of a peaceful resolution to the conflict? You know, Eileen, I'll put this back on you, but you've in the past you've written a paper comparing Nagorno-Karabakh to the Northern Ireland conflict. You know, what are the key events that help bring about the Good Friday Agreement, and how does it differ in this conflict? And what is missing? And this is a broader question to everybody else. What is missing from the current discourse to create a meaningful resolution?
Well, just briefly, several differences, I think, and which doesn't mean that things cannot be learned or that adjustments or evolution of the process in dealing with Nagorno-Karabakh couldn't take place. First of all, with Northern Ireland, you did have a mediator with legitimacy who was considered to be fairly even-handed. Not a huge amount of interests there that the mediators and the mediating team brought to the table. Secondly, you had sponsor governments, regional governments, the British government, the Irish government, who had already decided that they were going to take a step back and allow the people of Northern Ireland to make up their own minds. Big difference there. And the Anglo-Irish Agreement and several, preceding agreements between these two large neighboring entities to step back and allow this to go forward. Third, I think in negotiation, we talk about the notion of ripeness and of parties getting to the point where they believe that working things out on the battlefield is no longer desirable, and looking to negotiation as the best alternative. And that happened in Northern Ireland. And if you remember, before the Good Friday discussions, already a ceasefire was in place, and it was initiated by the parties. So all of this set things up in a very different way from what we have here now in Nagorno-Karabakh. So the question becomes what steps might be taken now to begin to put some of those favorable conditions in place, so that it's more likely that a negotiating process with Nagorno-Karabakh will have some effectiveness and legitimacy and actually go forward to something reasonable with an outcome. I think the choice of mediator is going to be quite important, and whether we have a choice, or the parties have a choice, I shouldn't say we, but the parties. Also, whether the parties, and in this case, I would think it would be Armenia and Azerbaijan, are willing and able to engage in a negotiation process in good faith. Mm-hmm. And that really means them taking a good hard look at what the alternatives to negotiation are, and being realistic about how good those alternatives are and whether their better interests are served at the negotiating table. And thirdly, a regional / international presence that supports negotiation and really encourages engagement in a constructive way, and not manipulating the process for other interests. Big questions about whether and how any of those things can happen, but I think those are the things we should be thinking about.
Thank you. Tom and Eric, do you have things that you want to add to to what Eileen has just said.
Well, Tom can go first and I'll finish up.
Well, sure. I mean, clearly, I think we're a long way. We have to be quite honest about this from any kind of political agreement and peaceful coexistence. Obviously, attempts at that can start now, but I think there's a lot of bitterness, obviously, on both sides. I mean, we've just got the Azerbaijani first casualty figures released today. They're actually pretty much the same as the Armenian ones, about 2,700. We're looking at about 6,000 people probably have died. That's at a minimum in this 6-week war. And so enormous bitterness, obviously 6,000 people in a region that small, you would have to multiply it by 10 or 20 times to get a comparable number in a European country or the United States. Bitterness of people displaced from the Hadrut region. We've probably got 30,000 people in Karabakh, mainly from that region, but from a few other places as well, probably unable to go and turn home. And I'm not someone who's, I'm an outsider in this dispute. Mentioned the bitterness which Azerbaijanis feel as they come back to the hundreds of thousands of people who are now seeing the regions that they used to live in, their former homes, sometimes graveyards as well, which were completely destroyed in the 1990s. So an awful lot of bitterness, and obviously years and years of official state propaganda and media coverage in which Armenia has been the anti-Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan even more strongly has been the anti-Armenia. That's not going to disappear overnight. What are the steps to beginning to work together, finding some common interests? Well, communication routes, the geography of the region is still so complicated that to get access, Azerbaijanis would logically want to get the Kalbajar region would logically want to be able to cross Karabakh. Well, also this issue of this corridor going across Megri, which is supposedly going to be built. Can there be some mutual interest in that the Armenians could use it? Russians will certainly want to use it. Armenians will certainly could have the opportunity to sabotage that corridor. So, and then there's, I guess, trade. Armenians and Azerbaijanis trade together in Georgia quite happily. In fact, in many third countries where they're under the flag of a third country, Armenians and Azerbaijanis actually get along fine in Georgia and Russia and so on. So possibly we could see bits of trade now that they're starting to live side by side again in Shusha and Stepanakert and so on. Maybe we'll see little bits of trade starting, which could be a bit lower the temperature between these two nationalities. But it's a very, very long process, and I have big questions about whether the leaderships on both sides really are invested in wanting to kind of cooperate with one another, given the tone of President Aliyev's victory speech, openly mocking Pashinyan, given some of the things that are still, Mr. Pashinyan himself is still saying. I have to say it's going to be a very long process, and as outsiders, we have to have as people who supported a Western diplomacy in this process. Western diplomacy was nowhere to be found in the last 2 months. We have to be honest about this. So we have to be a bit humble, those of us who advocated Western diplomacy. Obviously, I want to see a more European human rights-based approach and looking at reconciliation. But at the moment, it's about really stabilizing. It's about trying to get UN agencies in there, a bit more humanitarian access to Karabakh. So at the moment, it's for better or worse, it's about supporting this Russian deal.
Thank you. Eric?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to step away from these false moral equivalencies, to be honest with you. There's this very typical Western, what I call both-sidism. We have to be honest about this. Armenian children from kindergarten are not thought to hate Azerbaijanis. That level of hatred and vitriol that is sort of systematic in Azerbaijan, within that confines of that family-run, dictatorship versus a very open democratic system that exists here. And frankly, even prior to 2018, Armenia was a far more liberal country than Azerbaijan. That organized hatred, this almost this neo-fascist language that you get from Azerbaijan does not exist here. So let's not get into both side-isms here, because that's just not accurate. I think what Thomas touched on, which is I think very good, is you want to look at practicalities. And I think trade and open routes are practicalities. When people trade with each other, when these roads are open and eventually people feel safe to come and go, I think those are far more practical ways. For example, things like on water use. There's practical things that people can work together. You can do some kind of a very easy trade in which there's Armenian access to Karabakh that is safe, negotiated with something through Mehri for Nakhchivan, Azerbaijan connection, which is something that's very important to them. I think what you want to look at is small, concrete steps that are practical in nature. In the short term, these two populations need to be separated from each other. I think one thing that other people need to understand is the level of trauma that exists. That Turkish angle of involvement in this war raised the level of trauma in Armenians here and Armenians around the world to a level that was nothing to do with Azerbaijan. And the fact is, the main driver of this war, it was not for Turkish involvement or approval or support. One, there's a good chance this war would have not happened. And if it would have happened, it would have happened in a far smaller scale and it would have had different results. The Turkish military, the Azeri military was pretty much taken over after that debacle that they had in the Tavush region of July, in the July fighting there, was essentially taken over by the Turks, who brought in, let's not forget, international terror. This was a case bringing international terrorists to fight this war. In fact, if you take the State Department's definition of state sponsors of terrorism, and given the fact that the State Department itself has confirmed that they were trafficking in Syrian terrorists, both Azerbaijan and Turkey, within the US view, are state sponsors of terrorism. So we need to get away about who the aggressor was, who had clear intent in ethnic cleansing, and who was defending themselves, who used illegal weapons, cluster bombs. There's a hospital very near to where I live where you have all the victims of the white.
Eric, you're freezing.
Oh, can you see me
Yes.
now?
Yes,
Can you
yes,
see
we
me
can.
now? Yeah.
I thought it was
we want to have practicalities in the sense that you approach it in a pragmatic manner, but for 1 minute, we should not have some kind of a moral equivalency with these two sides in the context of this current war and who did what. So let's just be very clear. But I think practicalities, I think Thomas is right on. Trade, access, I think when people see the benefits of these things, they're far less apt to be interested in another war. I can tell you from the Armenian side, there's two minimal standards. And as long as these two minimal standards are met, you can have some kind of a long-term peace. One is the physical protection of people that live in Artsakh, one. And two is that under no condition do they ever live under direct Azeri rule. Because Azerbaijan, if it ever had a legal right to rule over people in Artsakh, through this war lost any moral right to rule over people in Artsakh. So, if Kosovo had the case for remedial secession, what the Azeris...
Eric,
there's been legal separation based on current rate laws and after the... leave this off at.
Eric, sorry, I think you're breaking up a little bit. Can you hear us? Can you all hear us?
finish. You can go.
Eric
Yes.
he turns off his video.
Yeah, Eric, you might need to turn off your video because your connection is a bit slow. While we're waiting, I'm going to move on because you've all raised something that leads on very nicely to my next question, which is the indifference of the West. My question to you is: are we in the West overwhelmed by conflict? And have we missed the critical impact this war will have on the region? When we compare also the language and the way that Eric talks about the both sidism that was used when reporting on this, when we compare how the Tigray crisis has been reported on and it's been done very confidently and in certain terms, why has there been such a stark difference in the reporting of this? So I know there's a few questions to that, but Eileen, if you want to maybe sort of try and unpack that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best one to answer that, Tatiana. I don't know why. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's been covered that way. I have noted in the American press, there's on the one hand, on the other hand, and very much what Eric is describing. I would be curious, though, from Eric's point of view, what you think, Eric, this both side reporting, how it might affect negotiations. In other words, the fact that it was a one-sided military engagement. How do you think that translates into what we do now vis-a-vis negotiations? I'm sorry, I don't mean to skip over your question, Tatiana.
That's a good question.
September, one of those countries, perhaps in the world. Now, most of the West is looked upon with disdain or contempt. And
Eric, you might need to, if you flip your camera, it might work because you're.
It doesn't allow me to cut.
This is better.
Video. Okay. Does it work now?
Yes, perfect.
Essentially, as I was saying, this place has gone from a place that was quite pro-Western into a place that, after what they see as the indifference of the West, that is quite contemptuous of the West and attitudes towards us, to the extent that I think whether we live or die is of no significance to anybody else. So that's the general. So I think that's where the Western.
You're still breaking up a little bit.
Or is this freeze? Are you hearing me?
Yes, now.
Yeah, I think this, as far as what this Western attitude comes from, I think there's an approved list of victims in the Western world, and we don't fit that victim profile, because if you're a Christian, and you look like we do, you're not on the approved list of victims. So no matter what is done to you, it's not, you're not going to get the same coverage as other people do. And there's a lot of, you can, as a historian, you can go back 1,000 years as far as the attitudes that the Western folks have had in regards to what I call the Eastern Christian world. You can go back 1,000 years about that. But ultimately, I think the reason the coverage is what it is because we don't look like the BBC version of approved list of victims. And so that's the coverage that we get. To answer Eileen's question.
Thank you. Tom, what about you?
Well, obviously I have a different perspective, and when it comes to both sidisms, I must admit I've been accused of both sidism by both sides in this conflict. Azerbaijanis have said, why have you not spoken up more about all our displaced people and what we suffered in the 1990s and so on. So, I think these are two, nations on the edge of Europe in a protracted and quite hard to understand conflict, while the world has been distracted by many other things. And those of us who feel we understand this conflict are a very small minority. It is hard to get across. And obviously there has been coverage of some of the more egregious episodes in this conflict. I have to say that includes on both sides, the missile strikes on Varda and Ganja by the Armenian side as well. And those have received attention, including the sustained shelling of Stepanakert. As a watcher of the BBC, I've seen some pretty good reports from the BBC as well. But the world unfortunately does not have much of a bandwidth for places like this. And I think again, some quite hard questions for Armenians about what they could have done over the last 20 years, to not allow this to come to a war. Obviously, it takes two sides for a war. Obviously, the Azerbaijani side was looking for an opening, but I think I would be, quite blunt in saying that I think Nikol Pashinyan, has done good things for Armenia domestically, but diplomatically, I think he's been pretty much a disaster, unfortunately, on this conflict. The way he's handled it, the way he hasn't made openings for negotiations, which I think was one element, only one of several elements, but one element that I think gave the Azerbaijani side an opportunity to try and solve this by military means. So, and then once it starts, the Western powers, they just do statements of concern. I'm afraid they don't intervene. They were never going to intervene. The only people who were going to intervene were the Russians. A lot of parallels between exactly 1 century ago, when there was this Turkish advance. There was the Treaty of Sèvres, which was kind of backed by the Western powers, but they had no means or even intention, I think, of enforcing it. It was just it was a dream rather than it was a treaty. Then there was the Kemalist Turkish advance on Armenia. Kars fell. Alexandropol, which was Gyumri, fell. Armenia was suddenly facing this defeat. Western powers at the League of Nations suddenly issued these statements of concern, saying that something ought to be done. And who came in? It was the Bolsheviks came in. They came in over the mountains. They stopped the Turks. They overthrew the First Republic. 1 century ago yesterday, the 2nd of December 1920, the Bolsheviks overthrew, almost kind of voluntarily overthrew, because the last government of the First Republic pretty much voluntarily handed over power to the Russians. So because they knew no one else was going to save them from the Turks. So quite a lot of differences, quite a lot of interesting parallels there of exactly what was happening 1 century ago. And the West is too far away. The West can assist you in negotiations. The West can assist you in many things, but when it comes to something like this, a century ago in 1920 and 2020, I'm afraid you're not going to get direct Western support.
So, let's take a step back and think about why this whole, why we are where we are today. And it's this long-standing demand for independence, right, for self-determination. We talk about the fact that there was a referendum, an overall majority, to something like the Brexit referendum only a couple of years ago, and how tight that result was, but yet we honored that. And then, you look at, you ask yourself, why was Nakhichevan offered that sort of autonomous rule versus Nagorno-Karabakh? I'd like to hear from. I'll start with you, Tom. On why do you think that this demand has been ignored for over a century now?
Well, we have to go back to. I don't think we've got time in this session to go back to the events of 1918 to 21, when there were no clear borders. There were two independent republics, but neither of them was internationally recognized, or at least maybe the governments at the end were internationally recognized, but not the borders. And so you ended up with these disputes over Nakhchivan, over Zangezur, and over Karabakh. And, you know, again, it was the Russians who came in their brutal way. They sorted it out. And Zangezur was kept by the Armenians. Nakhchivan went to Azerbaijan, and Karabakh had this kind of messy compromise of a kind of autonomous Armenian Karabakh within Soviet Azerbaijan. And we can go over that period for hours, I think. But I think, you know, that's the legacy that we were living, that the Caucasus was living with. And it has to be said, you know, it wasn't, if it had been in another part of Europe and in a more democratic culture, that could have been a livable solution. You know, if autonomy had meant something, if there'd been a democratic culture where the two sides could talk to each other and work something out. If this had been in the middle of Europe, I don't think it would have come to a war in 1991, 1988. But, you know, this was the Soviet Union. There was no culture of dialogue. Both sides appealed to Moscow basically to rule in our favor. They didn't talk to each other. And you know, we had the Sumgay a week after the Karabakh Soviets declaration. You had the Sumgay pogroms, February 1988, and it's been kind of downhill ever since, I'm afraid. You know, the question then is, I think, you know, these maximalist positions were drawn out increasingly, that on the one hand, an independent Artsakh, on the other hand, a Karabakh that has absolutely no status within Azerbaijan. And the kind of international peace plan in the middle was trying to kind of put a thread through that needle and say Azerbaijan gets the regions around Karabakh back, there's the Lachin corridor, the security for the Karabakh Armenians, and status is postponed. And I think, you know, maybe more Armenians, I used to say that this was actually not such a bad deal for the Armenians, and maybe more Armenians would agree with me today than 2 or 3 months ago, that was actually not an inequitable deal for the Armenians of Karabakh, but we are where we are, that you know, that deal was basically not acceptable in Yerevan. It was also not particularly acceptable in Baku either. So I'm not particularly casting blame, but I mean, I think to salvage something from that is now, I think, the challenge, the exercise. But if you ask me today, I'm not so optimistic, I'm afraid.
And Eric, what about you? I mean, why can't we come to a conclusion about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh and listen to the people?
Eileen is obviously, as she says, she's not an expert in this area, but I'm sure Thomas knows. Maybe he, in fact, knows better than I do. But there's been two serious attempts at reaching a compromise. One was in 2001 when in Key West met with Aliyev's father. And again, there's a bit of, since nothing was finalized, there's a bit of mythology. So no one knew what happened. But from what is understood is that there was an agreement that would have returned all of Nagorno-Karabakh back to Azerbaijan, all the former occupied territories, in exchange for independence or Artsakh with a connection through Armenia, in exchange for the return of all the territories and some kind of a road through Armenia to Nakhchivan that would have essentially been legal Azeri territory, from what I understand, from what many people understand. This was agreed to by both sides, and Aliyev goes back to Baku, changes his mind. Now, who talked him out of it? Nobody, even the case. So the Armenian side was more than willing to give up all the occupied territories once in 2001. In 2011, in Kazan, Serge Sarkisyan, the follow-up president, also Gharabafti himself, in fact accepted a worse deal, which is return all of these areas, keep Lachin, and to have a medius for Karabakh that was not clear, independence or unity with Armenia. Again, the current Aliyev rejected that. So what the maximalist positions, frankly, even though both sides can be unreasonable, and there are unreasonable factions in both countries, the maximalist positions come more from the other side, because I think ultimately what a good part of Azerbaijani society wants is Karabakh back without any Armenians. Mm. And you see this in the language and in others interested in peace. He doesn't talk about I chased them away, about the work of our Caucasus and the remnants of the sword. So there's been an effort. One side has been willing to give, while the other side has been not willing to give. So I think that's why we are where we're at. And I think if you're going to have any kind of an understanding here that actually works and holds, you have to essentially force people to sign things that both sides don't like. Otherwise, it's not going to work, because the two sides are too intransigent. Everyone has their maximalist positions. And you essentially, in none of those deals made in Yugoslavia, anyone was happy, whether it was Dayton or any of these agreements. Essentially, the world powers, and let's not forget, the countries in this region are all minnows, okay? If both powers say for whatever reason, for their own purposes, I think it's, I mean, I'm not going to argue with Thomas about what Putin is, but I think he wants some kind of a legal status that legitimizes his true presence there for his own purposes. The parties have to come in and somewhat enforce a solution that is unhappy. It's an unhappy existence for both sides, and life goes on. And I think I don't disagree with Thomas. I think that unsettled issue that you have forever say that this is part of our country.
Nope. I think we've lost Eric. I'm gonna actually, Eileen, while we're waiting for Eric, because I think his internet's cut off. Let me ask you then. Global conflicts around the world. There seems to be a cyclic pattern where that have been caused by arbitrary borderlines drawn up by outsiders who aren't concerned with the indigenous population's needs. I mean, does this have any place does this outdated colonial tactic have any place in the 21st century? And how, and how can we kind of move away from this sort of, in helping to resolve future conflicts, not just in this region, but around the world?
Well, that's a small question, Tatiana. The agreement to hold with current borders in some ways is, of course, historic, but also pragmatic. The African continent agreed to that, even in the face of decolonization, because they felt that if the borders were lifted, there would be chaos and continual conflict. Of course, there has been anyway. But the question about how and whether to change borders, the standing procedure at the moment, de facto, not really de jure, is that it's with permission of the parties and done according to, done nonviolently. And the exceptions to that usually are because, as others have said, great powers have stepped in and said, in this case, we make an exception. I don't see there being any change from that process at the moment. I think there is the argument that was raised earlier about sort of compensatory secession, where if parties feel that if there's a case to be made that there's an existential threat, that whoever it is that blesses such secession would go ahead and do so. there is no process for that. There really is no established mechanism for doing that internationally. Again, it's very ad hoc. I guess in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, the question would be, what is that case? How could that case be made? Who would support that case? To date, there has not been that support in the international community. There hasn't been any power that stepped up and said, this is a necessary step in order to protect these people. Maybe in the context of this current war, where there has been displays of tragedy and as some would say, as some have said, the thousands of people who've been killed, there's more of a case, sadly, that could be made. But I do think it's what we're looking at here is trying to get the powers that be to step in and do some mediation with muscle. Mm-hmm. Exactly what Eric just said, where the mediators are not hands-off. They're quite muscular, and they say, here are the parameters that have to be achieved. Here are the options we will, bless if they come out, and that's all you can choose between. But I think Russia on its own is maybe not sufficient to do that. And that's going to be a bit of a challenge, because I'm not sure that they're going to want to share the stage with anybody at this moment. If they're up to doing it and it actually results in something that the parties can sign on to, I think that would not be a bad thing. One amendment, though, I would like to make with what Eric just said. It's not only that the parties, it's not the fact that the parties will be unhappy with the outcome. That it's nobody's going to get everything they want here. And so unhappy should not be our problem. What is possible is what we should be going for is something that is enforceable and where people feel that they can actually live with it. Whether they're happy or not should not really be. I mean, if happiness means getting everything you want, we're never going to get there.
Thank you, Eileen. We're going to move on to questions in a couple of minutes, and I just want to get some last minute thoughts for you before we move into the Q&A session, which is, we've talked about some of the different issues, and, just kind of reflecting on where we go from here. And just thinking about this issue of self-determination, which is important. We're talking about a mediation process where the two parties, or the three parties in this case, because I do, in my own opinion, I think that it's very important that Nagorno-Karabakh has its own voice in this process. But how does that happen? How is there a solid chance for change when you have a disproportionate sort of balance in power? You have one very wealthy nation that doesn't actually need to negotiate. They've just won a war, versus a country that has been weakened by not just COVID, but a weakening economy, and they've just come out of a war that has destroyed it mentally, emotionally. So how is there a solid chance for change? Tom, if you guys could just I'll give you, you can say it briefly, because I'd like to give some time for some of the questions. I know we've got quite a few questions. So Tom, we'll start with you, and then Eric, and then Eileen.
Yeah, well, clearly Armenia and the Karabakh Armenians are in a much weaker position than they were, 2 or 3 months ago. So that I start with that. So it's about how do you build back leverage. It's about how do you and that, I think, largely to a great extent depends on how this Armenian domestic crisis is resolved, who ends up leading Armenia, and what kind of messaging and what kind of diplomacy they conduct, and then secondly it's about how viable Nagorno-Karabakh is. Clearly the Russians have a vested interest in making Nagorno-Karabakh viable, so as to justify their peacekeeping mission. But you know, people will be fearful of return, and I'm hearing two messages from Karabakh, but there are some people who say absolutely we're going to go back and we're going to resume life, and others who say, you know, I'm too afraid. So I think to persuade the second category of people to go back will require not just the Russians, but some kind of international humanitarian agents being there. It's going to, you know, it's going to be a big ask, but it's also I think an ask for, again, to get back to a previous question, which is about some kind of learning to live with your new old Azerbaijani neighbors.
Thank you. Eric?
I think I'm a bit more optimistic in the sense that I don't think this is a place, this is one of the few places, and I think the Russians see this as such, in which they can actually cooperate with the West. So I don't think this is not, especially given the fact that the Russians right now have boots on the ground, so they already have the advantageous position in any scenario. And I think this is a place where they'll be more than willing to not necessarily compete with the West, but as a place that they can cooperate with the West, especially with the divided administration. So I'm a little more optimistic about the specifics of that. But I'm going to be honest with you, I got cut off when you were asking your question. So please repeat your question. I'll try to answer it quickly.
No, I was just wanted to kind of get some thoughts before we move into some of the questions that the audience have, just on.
Then you should move to the questions then.
Okay, Eileen, do you have any comments you want to add before we move to our questions?
No, I don't think so.
Great. So first question is from Tatevik Ayvazyan, and it's directed at Tom. How does the start of the war and the way it was conducted sit within the principles of non-violence for resolution? And what are the mechanisms available within the OSCE Minsk group?
Yeah, well, clearly there were repeated calls over this last 25 years for non-use of force for peaceful resolution. But you know, I'm afraid we see in many conflicts around the world. We saw it in Croatia in the 90s. We saw it in Russia in 1999. You know, in the Second Chechen War, we saw in Sri Lanka. We've seen cases where a party, you know, enforces what is its internationally retakes what is regarded as its internationally recognized territory de jure by force, and the world is unhappy about that, but they get away with it. So I think what's more important now is, you know, to try and build something from this pretty bad, for the Armenian side, obviously, status quo, and try and make sure that there's no repeat of violence, and you know, again to try and get back to this question, try and to make Nagorno-Karabakh a viable place once more.
Thank you. Eric, I'll direct this question to you. What does Turkey or Erdogan want in the South Caucasus? And sorry, I'll just and how concerned should we be about longer-term security of Artsakh and Armenia?
Well, nobody knows what they really want. Frankly, in this case of this war, they did all the heavy lifting, they did all the work, and you know, they pretty much got very little out of it outside of highlighting their military prowess and their weapons that they want to sell. Because at the end of the day, when this agreement was signed, you know, Aliyev in many ways threw Erdogan under the bus, because the Turks, you know, essentially they get a chance to sit with the Russians an hour away from Karabakh and sip tea. But they have no boots on the ground in the Karabakh region. What they want is, I mean, this is clearly part of the whole Erdogan, and it's not just Erdogan, this is a state ideology at this point. There's sort of this new Ottomanist, we're going to reassert our, you know, political, economic, or military influence in different places. But the fundamental problem with this is that, you know, the problem with Erdogan is, you know, he's got Xi Jinping type ambitions with an Argentine type economy. So I think this is something that's going to, I don't think it lasts very long, to be honest, because they frankly can't afford it. and they just don't have the economic chops to fight what is essentially half the world at this point. I mean, one day it's attacking India, next day it's Israel, one day it's Greece. I mean, you can only do this for so long when your per capita income is $11,000 a year. So as far as how concerned we should be concerned, but I think over the next, the moment that at some point when Erdogan, probably sometime over the next 6 months to a year or a year and a half, has to go to the IMF, and the moment he does that, all of his political ambitions are done. Or regional ambitions are done.
Thank you. This is a question for all the panelists. How do you see the further development of Armenia? Is the best perspective to make a U-turn to the Middle East or a full immersion in the Eurasian system?
Well, I'll let others start, but I'll get back to that.
Go, Tom.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't want to be the ones. I mean, it's up to Armenians themselves to answer that question, really. I mean, clearly, sitting in London, someone who, and despite the West's complete kind of being missing in action on this conflict, I would like to see at least the democratic opening that happened in 2018 continue, with or without Mr. Pashinyan. I think it's possible without Mr. Pashinyan. And I would certainly, most of my Armenian friends that I talk to, which is obviously a self-selecting sample, do think that new elections seems to be the way out of this impasse. I'd be interested to hear what Eric says about the way out of the impasse. But I mean, I don't think, I do think that Armenia, of course, will maintain its links with Russia, will maintain its links with the Middle East, but I hope it would see also many benefits in increased cooperation with Europe. And there's a curious thing here which I'll raise, which is that formally, and I very much stress the word formally, there's the impediment to normalization of relations with Turkey is pretty much removed now, because it was all very much for Turkey. The impediment was the Karabakh conflict, that Turkey closed the border in 1993 after the Armenians captured Kelbajar region. Now, at the moment, of course, Armenian-Turkish relations are probably as bad as they've been since 1920, and there's no prospect of Armenia wanting to do that. But if Eric's right and Mr. Erdogan's economy is in a tailspin, and there are certainly signs of that, and we're looking at a post-Erdogan Turkey, then there could be in a few years' time, not immediately for sure, there could now be normalization of relations with Turkey, an open border, and that would open up Armenia's routes to Europe, communication, trade routes via Turkey. Now, a lot of ifs there, but I want to just signal that, flag that, and again, on a people-to-people level, Armenians have no problems in Turkey. There were flights to Antalya last summer. It's not the same as in Azerbaijan. There's obviously a massive problem at the elite level. There's a historic problem connected with the genocide. But on the people-to-people and normal, Armenians in the last 25 years have travelled to Turkey quite freely. So I just want to mention that, also put it out there. I'm not saying tomorrow, but I'm saying at some point in the future.
I think, though, it's fair to say that there was a little bit of unsettledness, not a little, but quite a bit of unsettledness, at least with even Turkish Armenians that I know, who didn't even feel comfortable to talk about the current conflict, just because of where they're located. But this is a question from Eric Hacopian, and Eileen, I'm going to direct it at you. The Azeris assume that the legal question is a walkover for them. What can the Armenians do to counter this and make their case?
Well, as I said a moment ago, I think that there's a moment here of that awareness has been raised. The long duration of the conflict being kind of under the radar it kind of slipped by. And here we now have graphic images of destruction and death and real hardship and tragedy. So I think this is a moment when when the Armenians can make the case. And I guess I would wonder about whether the case could or should be independence. I think it has to start with protection and security and acknowledgement that there is an Armenian presence that has been threatened, and that there's a short-term fix here, which is Russian peacekeepers, but that isn't long-term. And they have to but continue to build alliances and not assume that simply stating we want independence is sufficient. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been, and even under these circumstances, unfortunately, I don't think it will be. But there has to be a concerted effort to build alliances in the world with protection of this Armenian presence in Azerbaijan, even if it's short of an independence move. And that's got to be paramount, and I think that's something that's quite viable.
Thank you. This is a follow-up question. And, Tom, you or Eric are welcome to answer it. Does the French Senate's newfound support for Artsak's independence make any difference when it comes to real prospects of it officially succeeding?
No.
Okay.
Thank you. Straight to the point. I like it. Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. Right, well, let me move on to the next question then. If Russia held Erdogan at bay, will a successor to Putin be able or willing to do the same?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to say something about the Russian presence. You know, people keep talking about, I can tell you what the consensus thinking here, in not only here, but even among Azeris, is that, as you, all of you are from London, so you know when the Russians move in, they never move out. So this perception is that no one believes that they're going to leave in 5 years. In fact, everybody thinks they'll be here in 50 years. They've been waiting to get back here in 30 years. And the way these things work here is this notion that either of these sides is going to risk asking them to leave when they have quite the capability of coming up with an excuse not to leave. The consensus here is that they're here and they're not leaving. So I think this 5-year thing is more, nobody believes it's real. And that these guys are here for good. And just the forces that they're taking in there, the scale of it. I mean, the last number I got, they got 14,000 troops there. This thing's going to be a gigantic Russian base. And they're not moving in there to leave in 4.5 years. And if you know, there's one thing that's consistent about the Russian presence, is that they create an unhappy peace where they go. In all the places that they've been in, Abkhazia and all these places, they bring this, they freeze the situation unresolved, which is, I think, unresolved is actually helpful to their interests, but they do bring peace because everyone is afraid of shooting at them. Because if, unlike Swedish peacekeepers, if you shoot at them, they will shoot back at you. So I think there's a reasonable chance that we might have a 15, 20, even longer time period where this very unhappy peace that the Russians are holding for their own purposes holds. It's not out of the question whatsoever. And it is not even necessarily the worst thing that can happen given all the alternatives that can happen, which are pretty horrible, okay? And the other thing to remember, and this was to your previous question, you know, the prospects of countries change. The Azerbaijan of today and the Azerbaijan of 20 years from now are going to be entirely different countries. If you look at the oil production, income, and all these things, last year, Azerbaijan became, and I think they at some point this year they became, per capita, the poorest country in the Caucasus, per capita income, which is remarkable given the advantages that they have. 20 years from now, you could have a situation where Azerbaijan is not a particularly functional
Eric,
than she is. So nothing is set in stone for all eternity. And one of the reasons that Azerbaijan literally had to do the war now is because they actually had all the advantages, and they clearly understand that some of those advantages will dissipate over time. Oil production is going down every year. The world is flooded with natural gas. That this unhappy peace and make no one happy, but can make sure that if someone can tell me that for 15, 20 years, kids aren't going to die from both sides, I'll take that. I'll take that, because if in those 15 or 20 years, there's these people-to-people relationship, doors are open, and you're dealing with different countries 15 or 20 years from now, listen, in this part of the world, you don't look for perfection. You look for practicalities, and you look for things that work to a functional extent. And to me, peace is worth the sort of this unhappy, and I'll take an unhappy peace over the alternatives.
thank you. We've got a question from George Van Eastern. It's actually directed at you, Tom, but also Eric. There is a follow-up for you. You mentioned earlier that Pashinyan's handling of the conflict has been a disaster on the diplomatic front. In your opinion, what could any democratically elected Armenian leader have done better during the war or moving forward from here? So, Tom, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that. And Eric, they would like to also hear your thoughts as well.
Sure. Yeah, my connection is also getting a bit weaker, so I hope you can hear me okay. I'm moving closer to the screen. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly last couple. I would just talk about the last couple of years in which Mr. Pashinyan has, he's signaled that he wanted to kind of depart from the basic principles framework. I guess that was an honest statement. He felt it wasn't working, but it certainly. It was the only peace process that was out there, and by saying that he was departing from it, he, as it were, gave the license to the Azerbaijani side, saying, "Well, the negotiations aren't working." And there were a few other steps which I think went down extremely badly on the Azerbaijani side. For example, the inauguration of Mr. Harutyunyan in Shusha-Shushi, which was seen as a departure on the Armenian side. During the conflict itself, if Mr. Putin has given a few interviews and been quite frank, and he says that on October the 10th, there was a chance of a deal which was pretty much a quite similar deal to the one now, but in which the Azerbaijani side would have basically stopped short of taking the southern part of Karabakh and would have just had access to Shusha-Shushi. There would have been a much more kind of shared ownership of that town. Now, clearly, in retrospect, that would have been a much better deal for the Armenian side, and of course, many few people would have died. Would it be possible? We don't know many details, but would it have been possible to agree on that? We don't know. But I think to seriously countenance that, and say, yes, I want to stop fighting and talk about that deal, I think would have been, a much wiser step. I think we can all agree now from Mr. Pashinyan. And I would also say that the other thing is that he didn't seem to be talking to anyone. He didn't talk to the president, as far as we can tell. There was a meeting of the former presidents, 3 former presidents, and the 2 former presidents of Karabakh, who also met together and then wanted to talk to him, and he didn't seem to receive them. So he seems to have been acting pretty much unilaterally, and that, for someone who talks about the democratic dialogue, that also seems to have been a pretty substantial mistake as far as I'm concerned.
Eric.
Well, I think this is. I think Thomas is. We should not. Yes, I think Thomas is right on some of his points, specifically the points prior to the start of the war. But let's not forget, some of those things he was pushed on, since the opposition always went after him, that you're going to be soft on this issue. You're not a Karabakhtsi. You're a Western-oriented person. You're tied to Levon Tepetosyan, that was far more liberal on this issue. So he actually had to give this posture of toughness that I think in hindsight was a mistake. However, I think there's two factors here. I think all of the stuff that's being said during the war, I don't believe what anybody says, because I think everybody lies for their purposes, including Putin, including Pashinyan. And let's not forget, Putin and Pashinyan could have agreed to 1,000 things. The main driver of this war, after the first shot was fired, was not even Aliyev, it was Erdogan. Erdogan was the person that was keeping this war going. Otherwise, this war probably would have ended in the first ceasefire that the Russians negotiated on the 10th anyway. So Pashinyan can be held accountable for mistakes he made prior to the war. I think during the war, I think that the stuff with Putin, given the fact that he was not the primary decision maker in continuing the war was Erdogan, I think he gets too much of the blame for that. I think he should get the blame for whatever happened prior to the start of the war, because I think that's where it was more impactful. But let's not, at the end of the day, this was Erdogan's war more than anybody else. Aliyev would not have dared this, or he certainly would not have dared to stiff the Russians after 8 hours of negotiations and violate 7 minutes over when it's supposed to take effect, if he did not have Erdogan's backing. This was Erdogan's war more than it was Aliyev's war. So Pashinyan is a bit player compared to the decision Erdogan has made in the context of this war.
Thanks, Eric.
Tatiana, can I just say one thing here?
Yeah.
Not necessarily in retrospect, but thinking about going forward, whatever mistakes were made, rather than litigate or relitigate the blame, it seems very important for Armenia to think about its strategy now, and to come together on what that's going to be. If the scenario that Eric has laid out here is reasonably accurate about Russia staying and there being a cold peace, and 5 years is not the time frame, we're really talking much longer than that. And I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. The question is, so what does Armenia do here? Mm-hmm. And being passive is probably, yes, they are a small country, but that doesn't mean they have no options. And I do think there have to be much more systematic and strategic about how they plan what to do next, and think about all the elements of negotiation. What are their interests? What are their real interests here? How do they get themselves organized to be strategic about pursuing those interests? What kinds of alliances can they build? What options are available to them? I think they have to think very, very carefully and hard about this, and develop a strategy that's not simply passive and ad hoc.
And I think what you said, which is move away from the blaming and the sort of move from questions to sort of addressing the challenges and how you solve those challenges, because there is a lot to take on. I think, Eileen, to your point, and I think this is where, I speak as an Armenian and somebody who's in the diaspora, so I'm somewhat removed from this process, but we feel like we're firefighting, because especially the youth, everyone kind of feels like you are, you've been thrown into something and you're trying to fix a 30-year-old problem in a few days. And that's not how things happen. And you need, obviously, the powers that be to be willing to bring about change as well. So, thank you for that. I want to thank you all for this open discussion and for your thoughts on this issue. This is a very challenging time for everyone that's been involved in this conflict, and thank you for participating. Are there any final comments that any of you would like to make before we close? Well, I also want to thank our audiences then as well for attending and participating in this discussion. Please do visit the Armenian Institute website. You can find out ways of how to get involved and also learn about how to support us. And we have some more events coming up before the end of the year. And of course, we'll have a full program in for the new year as well. So thank you everyone for attending, and to our speakers especially.